around the world as we embrace the theme for the year, which is timeless wisdom, evolutionary vision. Here at Mountainside, we have a tradition of going back to the basics in January. We take Ernest Holmes' book, which was first written in 1926 and then revised in 1938. This is the 1938, that's the book that most of us have. And I always say it's the first chapters, but it's not the first chapter, it's the introduction to this work that gives us 4 sections that we're going to look at over the next couple of weeks. Each week we are going to take one section because I think that we need to reground ourselves in the basics so that we can then explore all these other ideas. So we're talking about the thing itself today. Then next week will be the way it works. The following week will be what it does. And the 4th week will be how to use it. And that sets us up to get to chapter 1 of this manuscript. So throughout the coming year, we're going to be exploring the ancient writings for this timeless wisdom that I believe is still so relevant for today, all ancient wisdoms, that allows us to work to create a world that works for everyone. In an early Science of Mind magazine back in, I believe it was back in the 1930s, Ernest Holmes wrote that the philosophy of religious science is nothing new to the world. It is rather a synthesis of the greatest concepts which have ever come to the mind of man. It is the law of Moses, the love of Christ, the ethics of Buddha, the morals of Confucius. It is the deep spiritual realization of the Hindus, the mystical revelations of the saints of the Middle Ages. It is the laws of parallels and compensation of Emerson, the logic of Kant, the spirituality of Swedenborg. It is the beauty of Browning and the wide universal sweep of Walt Whitman. All of these find an exalted place in the philosophy of religious science. In his book, That Was Ernest, a longtime friend, confidant, and fellow student of philosophy, Reginald Armour, wrote, Ernest felt that in synthesizing the wisdom of the ages, that he had something better, that each could go directly to the source, and that one needed no priesthood or intermediary to intercede on one's behalf or to act as a middleman. The science of mind concept is rather that each one maintains one's individuality in consciousness and thus has their own hotline to the Mother, Father, God. Throughout many cultures, religions, and philosophies of the world, God is called by many names. Allah, Yahweh, Abba, Elohim, Brahma, Adonai, Jehovah, Divine Spirit. These names are timeless in the expression of the eternality of spirit. God is timeless. There is no beginning and no end. And yet, through all of these ancient writings, what we share is our desire to know and to understand our relationship not only to the divine, but to the universe. And so by whatever name we use to have that connection, it is this desire to know and to understand that is the foundation of all timeless wisdom. This exploration of this question is also what inspires our visions and propels us into creating a better world, not only for ourselves, but a better world that works for everyone. This is this evolutionary vision that we have. Now, who was this man, Ernest Holmes? We'll talk about him in a minute, but I just want to remind you that as we go through these first couple of I always want to call them chapters, they're not chapters, sections of the introduction, it's just a wonderful opportunity to revisit the foundational beliefs and of current day applications, because, you know, we have just come through a tumultuous year, one that has been rife with conflict and fear of the unknown virus. That fear still remains today as we have this new strain that comes about. And for many, this past year of 2020 was a loss of employment and freedom of movement. We couldn't do some of the things that we wanted to do. We have experienced the loss of friends and family members, loved ones, without an opportunity to truly mourn our losses. Many of us are missing the human touch and the physical connections that we're used to having. However, 2020 has also been a year of slowing down, of returning to the basics in our own lives. It's been a year of change. And I also believe that it has been a year of growth and opportunity. So it's time to come back and anchor ourselves again in that which we know, that spirit is timeless. Spirit is permanent and present, and that spirit is untouched by world events. Yes, we want to acknowledge what happened in 2020. We can tally our losses and we can ask, what have we gained? We can mourn our losses and we can ask ourselves, what do I have to celebrate? And I think the best question to ask is, what delights me today? What brings me joy? We can move forward. So as we go back to the basics, we revisit these basics. We can take what we know and what we are learning and combine it with our creativity. And we can imagine a post-pandemic reality that works for everyone. Reverend Dr. Ken Gordon, who was our previous spiritual leader for the organization of Centers for Spiritual Living, reminds us that the lessons are dedicated to truth, which frees us from ourselves and sets us on the pathway of new experience. And that these lessons of truth enable us to see through the mist of worldly events, to see the eternal and changeless reality of spirit. So let's start. Who was this man, Ernest Holmes? Ernest Holmes was born in Maine in 1887. He was actually born in January. So it's fitting that we begin our new year at the same month of his birth. You know, his teachers described Ernest Holmes as being a young man who was a perpetual question mark. You know, he always had a question. And he was always looking and reading and seeking out this question of our relationship, his relationship with the divine. Again, referencing Dr. Ken, he said, Ernest's mind allowed him to see through the foibles of human thinking and directly into the soul of life. And in so doing, Ernest brought about a work that transcends the dogma and the doctrine of so much religious philosophy. And his work catapults, I love that, his work catapults readers into the principles of spirit itself, awakening within us an understanding of a relevant, personal, and purposeful spiritual philosophy. The science of mind is a philosophy for all denominations, all theologies, and all faiths. When Emerson, as his perpetual question mark, he was a voracious reader. He studied Emerson, he studied Whitman, he studied Thomas Troward, he studied Phineas Parker's Quimby. He studied the ancient philosophers. You know, the 1920s, the early part of the century, was this groundswell of creative thinking, not just challenging the norm, but asking the question of how can we create something better? Not to throw away the past, but to build upon it. And so Ernest Holmes was in the company of Emma Curtis Hopkins. He was in the company of James Fillmore. He was in the company of the leaders of Christian Science, of divine science. He was in the company of Swedenborg. He was looking at these ideas. And as he developed his ideas, which eventually became science of mind, his thought was to find that golden thread that within all the thousands of ideas in the world that could meld together as one. When he began teaching in Southern California, especially, many of his students were priests. He had priests, he had rabbis, he had Presbyterian ministers, he had Baptist ministers, he had Methodist ministers, he brought in yogis. He had this grand collective of people. And you know what he said to them was, let us find what is common in our teachings rather than what divides us. He challenged these early students of his to put aside their dogmas and their practices and to look at the principles of spirit. And that's where he continues to challenge us. He took the common truths that were found in most religions and he removed the concept of fear, leaving only love. Ernest Holmes believed that love is synonymous with God and that fear is made by man. He began his teachings in theaters. Well, he began his teachings in living rooms, in salons, moving to theaters, eventually creating the Institute for Religious Science, bringing forth this idea, this one idea that was a radical idea at the time. Again, we have to put this in perspective of time, 1920s, 1930s. His radical idea was that you didn't need an intermediary, that the spirit of the divine was within you, within me, and that we could tap into that directly. Ernest Holmes was radical for his day. He was indeed a revolutionary thinker. He had an evolutionary vision of what man or what our person's relationship with divine could be. Now, I say he was radical because one of the ideas that he had was to call God something different. Now we know all these different names of God today, but he said, even taking the name out of it, let's call it the oversoul, the eternal spirit, creative intelligence, divine power. He knew that for many people, the word God was something that created a little hiccup in their thinking. Even today, this is so relevant that we have people who stumble over the word God, who cannot see their own divinity, cannot see the love of God because of some past association with the word of God. Ernest Holmes described spirit, described God, described the study of science of mind as a study of first cause, of spirit, of mind, or that invisible essence, the ultimate stuff and intelligence from which everything comes. This divine intelligence is the power back of everything. It is what he called the thing itself. Now, many of you know that I came from a very fundamental background. And so for me to call God the thing itself was a big shift for me. I had to really think about that. I mean, it's taken me years to really embrace this idea of the thing itself, to call God it. And yet it's so beautiful because it is so expansive. It is so open, and yet it is so concrete. It is, spirit is the thing itself. There is nothing else. Ernest Holmes' second idea was this idea, again, a radical idea for his day. We don't think of it so much today, but in his day that he was writing this and teaching this idea that we have direct communication with one's higher power. The strongest, largest churches at the turn of the century was the Catholic Church that said you had to have an intermediary, that you couldn't just talk to God. And Ernest Holmes said, sure we can. We all talk to God. We're talking to God all the time. Sometimes I think we talk to God even when we don't realize that we're talking to God. I love to be outside. When I'm looking at the trees, when I'm outside, this morning I heard a red-tailed hawk. That's the song of God. God is everywhere. And we can have that direct communication, that direct sense. We can go within and know that we are one with this divine spirit, this divine creative power. The third radical idea that Ernest Holmes had was affirmative prayer. He called it spiritual mind treatment because he wanted it to be a specific set pattern. And Ernest Holmes was clear. You know, it's not that God responds to some people and not to others, that God responds to some prayers and not to other prayers. I loved it because he says it's rather how we respond to God. In affirmative prayer, we are not beseeching, we are not pleading, but rather we are affirming that there is that thing itself, which is the creative, divine power that is in everything. And we affirm that. And as we affirm that for ourselves and for our lives, we affirm it that it is the truth of the divine as well. Gene Houston, who was a uh, renowned scholar of world religions, wrote that if I were to state the essence of the teachings of science of mind, it would be that the highest God and the innermost God is one God, and that the core of each human being is the original creative genius of the universe. We're God's stuff on earth. We are the focalization of eternity. You know, consciously or unconsciously, we are directing the flow of the universal mind into form. And Gene Houston reminds us that this grants us tremendous power and a responsibility to make or break our world through the extraordinary working power of our minds. The science of mind takes seriously this idea of being recreated through the renewing of our minds. And not just the renewing of our minds, but also the renewing of our bodies and souls. That power lies within us. But the responsibility also exists that we must attune ourselves and we must take responsibility to orchestrate our thoughts and emotions toward higher purposes and towards creative ends. That's why I invite you to hold this intention over this next week for our country. It is our responsibility to lift ourselves up and to lift up the world in the consciousness of peace, in the consciousness of that divine wisdom and that divine harmony that is the true essence of our country, of our world. As we spoke in the peace meditation the other day, peace begins within ourselves. As we know God, as we know the divine spirit, peace begins within ourselves. And then it can spread through our homes, our communities, our country, our world, and the universe. We hold up the thing itself and take that power to create. We can hold this idea. We can live this idea of peace and harmony and of wisdom in our world. The science of mind. This shows us how to be active and creative citizens in the universe. And those are the steps that we're going to take over the next months, weeks, as we continue to be creative beings on this planet. That is the science of mind. Now, I was supposed to talk about the thing itself today. So in the next few minutes, let me run through the thing itself. Again, this is the first subsection of the introduction in this book. This is so here are some of the points about the thing itself. And again, remember that Ernest Holmes, he was pretty radical, He was pretty radical in his ideas of the day, in 1920s. One of the things he said was, the universe never plays favorites. Because the universe is built on principles of love and law. Going back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 45, Jesus wrote, God maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain to the just and on the unjust. Now, some people can get really kind of upset about this. I'm trying to be good, and this person over here is not being good, and yet God sends rain to all of us, right? But it's because of principle. It's because of love and law. This is also the good news for us. There is no judgment. And that was a radical idea also, because Ernest Holmes was presenting an idea of the divine as being non-judgmental. And this was a big switch from Catholicism or Puritanism, which I'm sure is what I came from, of the traditional church at the time. So much of their doctrine, so many of their practices were built on the idea of judgment. And he said, no, the great love of the universe must be one with the great law of its own being. And we approach love through the law. As the love of God is perfect, so the law of God is perfect. But we must understand both. One of the reasons why he used science was because he liked this idea of law, this idea of relativity, this idea of unchangeable. The thing itself is permanent, timeless, and unchangeable by world events. Now, the second point that comes out of the thing itself, he says, you know what? There is absolutely nothing supernatural about the study of life. Again, putting this in perspective, Many of the people, the mystics, the priests, if you think of the Mayan culture, the priests used magical practices and rituals to have domination over people. There was this idea in the Middle Ages that there was something supernatural about God. And you know what? There is something supernatural about God because it is super and it is natural. But it's not something that we cannot understand. So much of the early teachings through the Middle Ages, especially and earlier, there was taught a fear of the divine. Ernest Holmes said, approach the divine with awe, not fear. Because life is grounded in principle. And when we are grounded in principle, we are grounded in the law. And it is unchangeable. Ernest Holmes writes, the simple meaning of a true metaphysical teaching, the study of life and the nature of law, is governed and directed by thought, always conscious that we are always conscious that we live in a spiritual universe. That God is throughout all, around and in all, for us, for you, for me, for us. And he says, we will find that which today seems to be supernatural, after it is thoroughly understood, will be found spontaneously natural. As we study and learn, we see everything comes back to principle. The third point he made was that all thought is creative. Now, this is an interesting one because yesterday some of you participated in the visioning board and you were creative. On Thursday, we're going to start playing around with mandalas and we're going to color. We're going to be creative. We're going to just kind of allow that creativity some freedom and to begin to play with that. But our minds are always creative. And sometimes we have to stop ourselves. Because sometimes we create things that we don't necessarily want to create. And I don't like that idea. When I think about that all thought is creative, I'm thinking about creating a world that works for everyone. But then I also have to stop to realize that sometimes I create the crap that's in my life. By the words that I use, by the fear that I allow to grab a hold of me. So I have to have that responsibility to know that all thought is creative. So here's some creativity that I'm not taking responsibility for, but I know that it's true. So you see this little appendage I have here. So last week, I was so excited. I was out cutting wood, spent a whole day cutting up wood, got myself all ready to use a wood splitter, sent a picture to my older brother of the wood splitter that we had and this pile of wood that I was going to split. And my brother wrote back and said, make sure you come back with all your fingers at the end of the day. It's his fault. That's creative thinking. Because see, while I'm saying, I'm flexible, I'm strong, I can go out there and I can do this. The nagging thought in my mind was, make sure at the end of the day you have all your fingers. So this is my brother's fault. That's what older brothers are for. But that's what we do. We sabotage ourselves, and we have to remember that all thought is creative. So when we start our days, we want to start our days as Esther Hicks says, I look for only good. I know only good. I know only joy today. I know only love today. When I start my day, I don't start out by reading the news. I start my day when I open my eyes and I say, today is going to be a good day. I am going to see the joy. I am going to see beauty. I am going to see love today. We can choose which thoughts we have. All of our thoughts are creative, but we can choose to have creative thoughts that create beauty and joy and love. And we can choose to stand in principle and tell fear, not today. You can go with 2020 out the back door. All thought is creative. So let's use it for good. The last 2 points that Ernest Holmes has is that learning to trust will make us happy. Living in a spiritual universe, living in this universe of pure intelligence, in a perfect life dominated by love, by reason, by law, we are one with life. Ernest Holmes writes, when we learn to trust the universe, we shall be happy, prosperous, and well. Trusting that God is always God. So no matter what our emotional storm or what our objective situation is, there is always something hidden in the inner being that has never been violated. We may stumble, but always there is within us that eternal voice that is forever whispering in our ear. That thing which causes us to be on this eternal quest to know God, to know the thing itself. And when we know that and we trust that, we can be at peace. And the last thing which he spoke of, which is our spiritual principle for today, is that the divine nature is in every person. That we shall never encompass God, yet we shall always be in God and of God. The divine nature is in every one of us. And the mind that is within us is that one mind, that one creative intelligence that governs everything. The moon, the stars, the planets, and yes, our response to our day. Let us close in prayer.